The autumn wind of 1863 carried more than fallen leaves across the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, carried the scent of war. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her calloused hands against the rough wooden fence of her father's failing farm, watching as another procession of Union cavalry thundered past on the Cumberland Valley Pike. Their brass buttons gleamed like fallen stars against the gray October sky. But it was not the soldiers that captured her attention. It was the magnificent horses they rode. Another requisition notice. Her father Patrick wheezed from behind her, his consumption-racked voice barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery practice. The elderly Irishman clutched a crumpled paper in his trembling hands, his face pale as morning frost. They want thunder. Margaret's heart clenched like a fist. Thunder was their last decent horse, a coal-black stallion with white markings that resembled lightning bolts across his chest. More importantly, he was their only hope of surviving the winter. Without him to pull the plough for next spring's planting, the O'Sullivan farm would join the countless others abandoned since the war began. "They cannot have him, Da," Margaret whispered, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "He's all we have left." But even as she spoke those defiant words, she knew the futility of resistance. The Army of the Potomac was preparing for what military correspondents were calling the most crucial campaign of the war. General George Gordon Meade needed every available mount for his cavalry divisions, and the Confederates under Robert Edward Lee were reportedly massing near the Blue Ridge Mountains. As referenced in Harper's weekly coverage of the Pennsylvania theater operations, the Union forces were systematically requisitioning horses from civilian populations to maintain their cavalry advantage. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts, but these were different, measured, deliberate, expensive. A magnificent chestnut thoroughbred appeared around the bend, carrying a rider whose tailored uniform and polished boots screamed of wealth and privilege. Behind him rode a small entourage of similarly well-appointed men, their horses' tack gleaming with silver and brass. "That would be Colonel Reginald Ashworth III," Patrick muttered, spitting into the dust. "Richest man in 3 counties, they say. Made his fortune in railroads and government contracts." Margaret had heard the stories. Ashworth owned the largest stable in Pennsylvania, housed in a mansion that rivaled anything in Philadelphia. He had personally donated 50 horses to the Union cause, a gesture that earned him his honorary colonelcy and considerable influence over military procurement decisions. Some whispered that he used his position to acquire the finest horses for himself before they could be distributed to common soldiers. The colonel dismounted with practiced grace, his steel-grey eyes surveying the O'Sullivan property with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His perfectly waxed mustache twitched slightly as he took in the modest farmhouse, the patched barn, and the meager fields that spoke of poverty and struggle. "Mr. O'Sullivan," Ashworth's voice carried the crisp authority of education and breeding, "I understand you possess a stallion of considerable quality. I'm prepared to offer you fair compensation, more than the army would provide through requisition." Margaret stepped forward, her green eyes flashing with the fire of her Celtic ancestors. "Thunder is not for sale, Colonel." Ashworth's gaze shifted to her, and something predatory flickered in his expression. "Miss O'Sullivan, I presume. I'm afraid sentiment is a luxury few can afford in wartime. Your father's debt to the bank, combined with this year's failed harvest, leaves you with precious few options." The words hit like physical blows. Margaret knew their financial situation was desperate, but hearing it spoken aloud by this arrogant stranger made the reality inescapable. The farm was mortgaged beyond hope, and winter was coming fast. "I'll give you $200, Ashworth continued, producing a leather wallet thick with bills. "More than enough to satisfy your creditors and see you through the winter. All I ask in return is the stallion." Patrick O'Sullivan's hands shook as he stared at the money more cash than he had seen in 5 years of farming. Margaret watched her father's resolve crumble like autumn leaves, knowing that survival often demanded sacrifices that honor could not afford. But before either could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of their small barn. The sound that emerged from the O'Sullivan barn was unlike anything Margaret had ever heard. A wild, primal scream that seemed to contain all the fury and freedom of the untamed frontier. Thunder's call was answered immediately by a chorus of whinnies and stamping hooves from Ashworth's magnificent horses. But their responses seemed somehow diminished, domesticated, lacking the raw power that resonated in the stallion's voice. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Patrick breathed, crossing himself as thunder burst through the barn doors. The stallion was a sight to behold. 17 hands of pure muscle and sinew, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the afternoon light. But it was not thunder alone that commanded attention. Pressed close against his massive shoulder was a smaller figure, a colt barely 2 years old, covered in mud and burrs from the back pasture, where he had been running wild since birth. Margaret's heart swelled with pride and sorrow as she watched the pair approach. The colt, whom she had named Tempest for his unpredictable nature, had never accepted a bridle or saddle. He was too wild, too spirited, too stubborn for any practical use on a working farm. Patrick had often complained that feeding the useless animal was a waste of grain they could not spare. But Margaret had refused to let him be sold or destroyed. Colonel Ashworth's eyes widened with genuine appreciation as he studied Thunder's magnificent form. Here was a horse worthy of his stable, an animal that could command respect on any battlefield or parade ground. His gaze barely registered the mud-covered colt beside the stallions. Such a scrappy, unkempt creature was beneath the notice of a man of his refined tastes. "Magnificent," Ashworth murmured, extending his hand toward Thunder's muzzle. "Absolutely magnificent. I can see why the army procurement officers were impressed." But as he stepped forward, something extraordinary happened. Thunder, who had always been gentle with humans, despite his size, suddenly reared back, his eyes rolling white with alarm. The stallion's massive hooves pawed the air dangerously close to Ashworth's perfectly groomed head, forcing the colonel to stumble backward in undignified haste. "Easy, boy," Margaret called softly, moving toward the agitated horse. "Easy now." At the sound of her voice, Thunder immediately calmed, lowering his front hooves to the ground and waffling gently against her outstretched palm. But Tempest, the mud-covered colt, did something that made everyone present freeze in astonishment. The young horse walked directly to Margaret's side and pressed his dirty muzzle against her worn dress, leaving streaks of mud on the faded fabric. Then, in a gesture that seemed almost human in its deliberate nature, Tempest turned to face Colonel Ashworth and the assembled soldiers, placing himself between the wealthy man and Margaret as if declaring his protection. "Well, I'll be damned," one of Ashworth's men muttered under his breath. The colonel's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. He was not accustomed to being rejected by anyone or anything, least of all a filthy farm animal. His hand moved instinctively to the riding crop at his side, but he caught himself before making such an undignified display. "The stallion is clearly poorly trained," Ashworth said tersely. "No matter. With proper handling, such behavioral issues can be corrected." I maintain my offer $200 for the black horse. And what of Tempest? Margaret asked quietly, her hand resting on the colt's neck. Ashworth's lip curled with distaste as he examined the mud-covered animal more closely. Tempest was smaller than Thunder, his coat a mottled brown and white that spoke of mixed breeding rather than the pure bloodlines Ashworth prized. Burrs tangled his mane, and his legs bore the scars of running through brambles and stone walls. The colt is worthless, Ashworth declared, clearly of inferior breeding, untrained, and far too small for military service. You may keep him, have no use for such an animal. The words stung Margaret more than she cared to admit, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged those who inflicted it. However, Ashworth continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. I understand that horses often form attachments to their familiar surroundings. If separating them causes the stallion distress, I am prepared to take both animals. I'll add $50 to my offer, $250 total. Margaret felt her father's hopeful gaze boring into her back. $250 would not only save the farm, but provide enough surplus to make improvements. Perhaps even purchase a replacement workhorse. It was more money than their family had ever possessed at one time. But as she looked into Tempest's dark eyes, something inside her rebelled against the practical choice. This colt had chosen her, had positioned himself as her protector despite his small size and youth. How could she sell him to a man who had already declared him worthless? I need time to consider your offer, Colonel, Margaret said finally. Ashworth's expression darkened. Time is a luxury, Miss O'Sullivan. The Army's requisition order takes effect at dawn tomorrow. If you refuse my generous offer, your horses will be taken regardless, and you will receive only the standard military compensation, $30 per animal. The threat hung in the air like smoke from distant cannon fire, and Margaret realized that their choice was not between selling and keeping their horses. It was between selling to Ashworth and losing everything to the Army. As if sensing the tension in the air, Tempest stepped closer to Margaret's side. His muddy coat pressed against her skirts in a gesture of absolute trust and loyalty. The October night fell upon the O'Sullivan farm like a dark shroud, bringing with it the distant sound of military preparations echoing across the Pennsylvania countryside. Margaret sat on the porch steps, her woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, listening to the rhythmic hammering from the Union camps where soldiers prepared for what many believed would be the war's decisive engagement. The Battle of Mine Run was imminent, though none of the civilian population yet knew the name that history would assign to the coming conflict. Tempest lay beside her on the wooden planks, his head resting against her lap despite Patrick's earlier protests about allowing the muddy colt onto the porch. Thunder grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock, his black coat invisible in the darkness save for the white markings that caught the pale moonlight like captured lightning. You know we have little choice, daughter, Patrick said softly from his rocking chair, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. Ashworth's money could save us, and the Army will take them anyway come morning. Margaret stroked Tempest's tangled mane, feeling the warmth of his small body against her legs. There's something about that man that troubles me. The way he looked at Thunder, at us like we were property to be acquired rather than people to be respected. But respect doesn't pay creditors or put food on the table through winter, Patrick replied, dissolving into a fit of coughing that left him gasping for breath. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, though these riders moved with stealth rather than the thunderous approach of Ashworth's earlier visit. Margaret tensed, her hand instinctively moving to Tempest's neck, but relaxed when she recognized the blue uniform of a Union cavalry officer emerging from the shadows. "Evening, folks," the officer called softly. "Captain James Morrison, 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry. I apologize for the late hour, but I'm conducting final assessments of available mounts in the area." Captain Morrison dismounted from a serviceable bay mare, his movements betraying the exhaustion of a man who had spent countless hours in the saddle. Unlike Colonel Ashworth's pristine appearance, Morrison's uniform bore the honest stains of campaign life: mud on his boots, dust on his jacket, and the weathered look of a soldier who had seen real combat. "You'd be here about thunder," Margaret said, rising to her feet with Tempest beside her. "Among other things," Morrison replied, his gaze taking in both horses with professional interest. "I've heard reports of an exceptional stallion, but I'm more curious about your companion there." Margaret looked down at Tempest in surprise. "This Colt, he's barely broken to lead, Captain. Colonel Ashworth declared him worthless earlier today." Morrison's weathered face creased into a slight smile. "Did he now? Well, Colonel Ashworth knows fine horses for parade grounds and fancy riding. But I know horses for war, Miss O'Sullivan, and sometimes the finest breeding matters less than heart and intelligence." As if responding to the captain's words, Tempest raised his head and studied the soldier with bright, alert eyes. Morrison extended his hand slowly, allowing the colt to catch his scent before gently touching his muzzle. "This one's been watching us since I arrived," Morrison observed. "Notice how he positioned himself between you and potential threat. That's not trained behavior, that's instinct. Some horses are born with the temperament for battle, regardless of their pedigree." Margaret felt a flutter of hope in her chest. "You would consider taking Tempest instead of Thunder?" "I'd consider taking both, if circumstances were different," Morrison admitted. "But my orders are specific. I need mature, trained mounts ready for immediate service. The enemy is moving, and we expect engagement within days." As referenced in military dispatches later published in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Union intelligence had confirmed that Confederate General Robert Lee was positioning his forces for a major offensive, with cavalry screens already probing Federal positions along the Rapidan River. The urgency of the situation left little time for training green horses, no matter how promising they might appear. However, Morrison continued, there may be alternatives to consider. The Army's Commissary Department has been seeking reliable suppliers of provisions and equipment. A man with good horses and local knowledge could earn decent compensation as a civilian contractor, avoiding the outright loss of his animals. Patrick leaned forward in his rocking chair, suddenly interested. "What sort of compensation, Captain?" $50 per month, plus expenses, for a man willing to transport supplies between our camps and the railhead at Culpeper. Dangerous work. Mind you, Confederate raiders are active in the area, but it would allow you to keep your horses while serving the Union cause. Margaret's heart leaped at the possibility, but she forced herself to remain cautious. "And if we've already accepted Colonel Ashworth's offer?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "Ashworth's a powerful man with considerable influence, Miss O'Sullivan. If you've given your word, I'd advise keeping it. But if the agreement isn't finalized," he let the sentence hang meaningfully. A new sound interrupted their conversation, the distinctive clip-clop of expensive horses approaching at a walk. Margaret's stomach sank as she recognized the measured pace of Ashworth's thoroughbreds, though she couldn't understand why the colonel would return so late at night, expecting company. Morrison asked quietly, his hand moving instinctively to his saber hilt. Not exactly, Margaret replied, watching as torchlight flickered between the trees lining their lane. Ashworth emerged from the darkness, leading a small group of mounted men, their faces grim in the wavering torchlight. Unlike his earlier visit, the colonel's manner suggested urgency rather than casual negotiation. "Captain Morrison," Ashworth called as he dismounted. "I hadn't expected to find military personnel here at this hour." "Colonel Ashworth," Morrison replied coolly. "I could say the same about civilian contractors." The tension between the two men was immediately apparent, though Margaret couldn't understand its source. Ashworth's jaw was set with determination, while Morrison's hand remained near his weapon. "I've come to finalize our earlier arrangement," Ashworth announced, producing his leather wallet. "Miss O'Sullivan, I'm prepared to increase my offer to $300 for both horses, payment in gold coin rather than currency." The sum was staggering more money than the O'Sullivan family had seen in a lifetime of farming. Margaret felt her father's sharp intake of breath behind her, knowing that such wealth could transform their circumstances entirely. But as she looked down at Tempest, still pressed loyally against her side, she realized that some choices transcended mere financial considerations. "Why the sudden urgency, Colonel?" she asked quietly. Ashworth's eyes glittered in the torchlight. "Let's simply say that military priorities have a way of changing quickly in wartime, Miss O'Sullivan. My offer stands until dawn. After that, circumstances may become considerably more complicated." The first light of dawn on October 1863 painted the Pennsylvania sky the color of dried blood, an ominous portent that would prove prophetic before the day's end. Margaret stood in the farmyard, her decision weighing heavily upon her heart as she watched Colonel Ashworth's men prepare their horses for departure. The $300 in gold coins felt impossibly heavy in her apron pocket, yet somehow the weight of Tempest's trusting gaze felt even heavier upon her soul. "You've made the right choice, Miss O'Sullivan," Ashworth said, adjusting his pristine gloves as his men led Thunder toward the waiting horse trailer. "Sentiment is a luxury that few can afford in times such as these." Captain Morrison stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious disapproval in his eyes. He had remained throughout the night, ostensibly to ensure that military protocols were followed. But Margaret suspected his true purpose was to witness whatever game Ashworth was playing. "The Colt comes with us as well," Ashworth continued, gesturing dismissively toward Tempest. "A bonus animal, though admittedly of limited value." Margaret's heart clenched as she watched Thunder being loaded into the trailer, the magnificent stallion's eyes wide with confusion and distress. But it was Tempest's reaction that truly broke her heart. The young Colt had refused to approach the trailer, instead pressing himself against Margaret's side with desperate determination. "He won't go willingly," Margaret observed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then he'll go unwillingly," Ashworth replied curtly, nodding to his men. "Thomas, bring rope. We'll drag him if necessary." "That won't be needed," a new voice interrupted from the lane. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching on a dust-covered cavalry horse, his Union uniform bearing the insignia of a major in the intelligence service. Margaret noticed Captain Morrison's immediate recognition of the newcomer, followed by a sharp salute. "Major William Hendricks, Army Intelligence," the officer announced as he dismounted. "Colonel Ashworth, I need to speak with you immediately regarding certain irregularities in your recent horse acquisitions." Ashworth's face paled slightly, though he maintained his composure. "Major, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. All my transactions have been conducted through proper civilian channels. Have they, indeed? Hendricks produced a leather folder from his saddlebag. According to our records, you've acquired 43 horses in the past month, allegedly for donation to the Union Cavalry. However, only 18 animals have actually reached military service. Care to explain the discrepancy? The silence that followed was broken only by Thunder's anxious whinnying from the trailer and the distant sound of artillery practice from the military camps. Margaret felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. I fail to see how my private business concerns military intelligence, Ashworth said stiffly. It becomes our concern when those horses are being sold to Confederate agents, Hendricks replied coldly. We've intercepted communications indicating that premium Union horses have been appearing in enemy cavalry units. The trail leads back to your operation, Colonel. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. The implications were staggering. Ashworth had been playing both sides, acquiring horses under the pretense of patriotic donation, while secretly selling them to Confederate forces for enormous profit. These are serious accusations, Major Ashworth said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I trust you have substantial evidence to support such claims. Indeed I do, Hendricks replied, opening his folder. Witness testimony from 3 separate sources, including a Confederate deserter who personally delivered horses to General Jeb Stuart's cavalry division. Horses bearing distinctive markings that match animals allegedly donated to Union forces. As referenced in classified military dispatches, later declassified in 1912, Confederate cavalry units had indeed received a significant influx of high-quality horses during the autumn of 1863. Animals that bore suspiciously close resemblance to stock supposedly donated by wealthy Union sympathizers. Margaret looked at Thunder in the trailer, his magnificent form suddenly representing far more than a family's desperate financial situation. If Ashworth succeeded in taking him, the stallion might soon be carrying Confederate cavalry against Union forces, perhaps even against Captain Morrison and his men. The transaction is complete, Ashworth declared, producing the signed papers. Margaret had reluctantly signed earlier. The horses are legally mine, regardless of what I choose to do with them afterward. Actually, Major Hendricks said with a slight smile, that's where you're mistaken. Under the Emergency War Powers Act, any civilian assets suspected of being used to aid the enemy can be immediately seized by military authority. Ashworth's composure finally cracked, his face flushing red with rage. You have no right. I have every right, Hendricks interrupted. Captain Morrison, please take custody of these animals pending a full investigation into Colonel Ashworth's activities. Margaret watched in amazement as Morrison's men quickly surrounded Ashworth's group, their hands resting meaningfully on their weapons. The colonel's hired men seemed suddenly less confident when faced with actual soldiers rather than desperate farmers. But as Thunder was being led from the trailer, disaster struck in the form Margaret had least expected. Tempest, apparently sensing the tension and confusion in the air, suddenly bolted from her side with a wild whinny that seemed to contain all the fury of his untamed spirit. The Colt charged directly toward Ashworth, not in attack but in what appeared to be panic. Horse, a high-strung thoroughbred already nervous from the confrontation, reared violently at the unexpected approach. The colonel, caught off guard and seated insecurely in his saddle, tumbled backward with a cry of alarm. The fall itself might not have been serious, but Ashworth's foot caught in the stirrup, and his panicked horse began to drag him across the rocky farmyard. Margaret watched in horror as the man who had threatened her family's livelihood was pulled helplessly behind his own expensive mount. "Stop the horse," Morrison shouted, spurring his own mount forward in pursuit. But it was Tempest who responded. First, the muddy Colt, displaying intelligence that surprised everyone present, positioned himself directly in the path of Ashworth's runaway horse and planted his feet firmly on the ground. The thoroughbred, forced to choose between trampling the smaller animal or stopping, chose to halt so abruptly that Ashworth's foot finally came free from the stirrup. Margaret rushed to the Colonel's side, her natural compassion overriding her personal feelings about the man. Ashworth lay motionless in the dust, his perfectly groomed appearance ruined by dirt and blood, his breathing shallow and labored. "He's alive," she announced, checking for a pulse, "but he needs medical attention immediately." Major Hendricks knelt beside the fallen man, his expression grim. "Captain Morrison, send a rider for the regimental surgeon, and place this man under arrest assuming he survives his injuries." As the sun climbed higher over the Pennsylvania countryside, Margaret realized that the events of this morning had changed far more than just her family's financial situation. The war had reached into her small world in ways she never could have imagined, and the choices that lay ahead would test loyalties she had never questioned. Tempest stood nearby, still breathing heavily from his dramatic intervention, his muddy coat gleaming in the morning light like armor worn by an unlikely hero. The regimental surgeon arrived within the hour, his field medical kit clattering as he dismounted from a lathered cavalry horse. Dr. Samuel Harrison had tended countless battlefield wounds during his service with the Army of the Potomac, but treating a suspected traitor posed unique challenges that went beyond mere medical considerations. Concussion, several broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder, Harrison announced after his examination of Colonel Ashworth. "He'll live, but he won't be going anywhere for several weeks." Major Hendricks nodded grimly. "That may be for the best. It gives us time to conduct a thorough investigation into his activities." Margaret stood beside Tempest in the farmyard, her hand resting on the colt's neck as she watched the unfolding drama. The morning's events had transformed her family's simple financial crisis into something far more complex and dangerous. The $300 in gold coins still weighed heavily in her apron pocket, but she now understood that accepting Ashworth's money might have made her an unwitting accomplice to treason. "Miss O'Sullivan," Major Hendricks approached, his manner respectful but businesslike. "I'm afraid your horses will need to remain in military custody pending our investigation. However, given your cooperation and the circumstances, I'm authorized to offer immediate compensation at fair market value." "What about Captain Morrison's offer?" Margaret asked. "The courier contract you mentioned." Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "That offer stands, but the situation has become considerably more dangerous. Confederate intelligence will soon learn of Ashworth's arrest, and they'll be looking for alternative sources of information and supplies. Anyone associated with this affair could become a target." Patrick O'Sullivan, who had remained silent throughout the morning's dramatic events, finally spoke from his seat on the porch. "Daughter, perhaps it would be safer to take the military compensation and have done with it." But Margaret found herself looking at Tempest, remembering how the young Colt had positioned himself between her and potential threats, how he had somehow sensed the danger Ashworth represented and acted to protect her. The animal had shown more courage and loyalty in one morning than most humans displayed in a lifetime. "Major," she said quietly, What would happen to the horses if I accepted your compensation? Thunder would likely be assigned to a cavalry unit preparing for active service, Hendricks replied honestly. As for the Colt, ... double quotes, he studied Tempest with professional interest. Honestly, most military commanders would consider him too young and untrained for immediate use. He'd probably be sent to a training depot, assuming he survived the journey. The thought of Tempest alone in a military training facility, surrounded by strangers who might not understand his unique spirit, filled Margaret with unexpected anguish. She had already lost so much: her mother to influenza, their prosperity to failed harvests, her hopes for a normal life to the demands of war. The idea of losing this loyal creature who had chosen her seemed unbearable. "I'll take the courier contract," she announced, surprising everyone present, including herself. "Margaret," Patrick protested, struggling to rise from his chair. "It's far too dangerous for a young woman. I can handle horses better than most men, and I know every road and trail in 3 counties, Margaret interrupted. "Besides, Captain Morrison said they needed someone with local knowledge." Morrison studied her carefully, clearly weighing the practical benefits against the obvious risks. "Miss O'Sullivan, Confederate raiders have been increasingly active in this area. Just last week, they ambushed a supply wagon near Warrenton, killing 2 teamsters and making off with desperately needed medical supplies. This isn't work for the faint of heart." "I understand the dangers, Captain," Margaret replied. "But I also understand that my family needs income, and my horses need purpose. Thunder is too fine an animal to waste on parade duty, and Tempest, well, perhaps he deserves a chance to prove his worth." Major Hendricks exchanged glances with Morrison, some unspoken communication passing between the 2 officers. Finally, Hendricks nodded slowly. "There is precedent for civilian contractors in supply operations," he admitted. "And frankly, we're desperately short of reliable personnel. The recent Confederate successes have made many civilians reluctant to work with military forces. What exactly would be required?" Margaret asked. Morrison produced a map from his saddlebag, spreading it across a nearby wooden crate. "Supply runs between our forward positions near Brandy Station and the railroad, depot at Culpeper Courthouse, approximately 30 miles each way through territory that changes hands with disturbing frequency." He traced the route with his finger, pointing out key landmarks and potential danger areas, as referenced in Harper's weekly coverage of the Virginia theater operations. The region between the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers had become a deadly no-man's land where both armies conducted constant patrols and raids. "The work pays $50 per successful round trip," Morrison continued, "plus bonuses for special cargo such as medical supplies or ammunition. A reliable courier could earn substantial money, assuming they survived long enough to collect it." Margaret studied the map, her mind calculating distances and memorizing terrain features. She had traveled much of this country during better times, accompanying her father to markets and visiting relatives. The roads Morrison indicated were familiar, though she had never traversed them during wartime conditions. "When would I start?" she asked. "Immediately, if you're truly committed," Hendricks replied. "We have a medical supply shipment that must reach Brandy Station within 48 hours. The field hospitals are running critically short of morphine and surgical instruments." The weight of responsibility settled upon Margaret's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She understood that accepting this mission would make her a legitimate military target, that Confederate forces would show no mercy to anyone caught supplying Union armies. But she also understood that her choices had narrowed to this single path forward. "I'll need both horses," she said firmly. Thunder for riding and Tempest as a pack animal. Morrison looked skeptical. Miss O'Sullivan, that Colt has never been properly trained. In dangerous situations, an unreliable animal could cost you your life. Margaret looked at Tempest, who stood quietly beside her, as if understanding that his fate was being decided. The young horse had already demonstrated intelligence and loyalty beyond his years. Perhaps it was time to discover what other qualities lay hidden beneath his muddy exterior. "He chose me, Captain," she said simply. "Now I choose him." As the morning sun climbed higher over the Pennsylvania countryside, Margaret O'Sullivan found herself committed to a path she could never have imagined 24 hours earlier. The war that had seemed so distant was now demanding everything she had to give her skills, her courage, and quite possibly her life. But as she looked at her father's hopeful expression and felt Tempest's warm breath against her hand, she realized that some choices transcended mere survival. Sometimes, a person had to choose loyalty over safety, courage over comfort, and love over logic. The Battle of Mine Run was still days away. But Margaret's personal war was about to begin. The medical supply wagon departed the O'Sullivan farm at dawn on October 30th, 1863, with Margaret O'Sullivan at the reins and both Thunder and Tempest in harness. The early morning mist clung to the valleys like ghostly fingers, providing welcome concealment as they made their way toward the contested territory between the opposing armies. Margaret had spent the previous evening receiving hurried instruction from Captain Morrison on military procedures, recognition signals, and emergency protocols. The wagon she drove contained precious cargo morphine, surgical instruments, and bandages desperately needed by Union field hospitals treating casualties from the ongoing skirmishes that preceded major engagements. Remember, Morrison had emphasized during their final briefing, if you encounter Confederate forces, you're simply a local farmer delivering supplies to relatives in Culpeper. The false papers in your satchel should support that story. But if they discover the medical supplies, he hadn't needed to finish the sentence. Both armies executed suspected spies and saboteurs with ruthless efficiency, and gender provided no protection from such military justice. Thunder moved with steady confidence along the familiar roads, his powerful muscles easily handling the weight of the loaded wagon. But it was Tempest who surprised Margaret with his alertness and intelligence. The young Colt seemed to sense the danger inherent in their mission, his ears constantly moving as he scanned their surroundings for threats. The first 20 miles passed without incident, the autumn countryside appearing deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Farms stood abandoned, their fields unharvested, and their buildings bearing the scars of military occupation. Occasionally, Margaret glimpsed distant smoke columns that might have indicated campfires or burning buildings in wartime. Such distinctions often proved meaningless. As they approached the crossroads near Stevensburg, Tempest suddenly tensed, his head raised high and his nostrils flaring. Margaret immediately slowed the wagon, trusting the Colt's superior senses to detect whatever had alarmed him. The sound reached her ears. Moments later, the distinctive jingle of cavalry equipment and the muffled conversation of mounted men. Margaret's heart began racing as she realized that a large group of horsemen was approaching from the direction of Brandy Station, though their identity remained unknown. "Easy, boys," she whispered to both horses, guiding them off the main road and into a grove of oak trees that offered partial concealment. The riders appeared around a bend in the road, and Margaret's blood ran cold as she recognized their gray uniforms and battle flags. Confederate cavalry, at least 30 strong. moving with the confident swagger of men who owned the territory they patrolled. Leading the column was an officer whose reputation preceded him. Throughout Virginia Major, John Singleton Mosby, the infamous Grey Ghost whose guerrilla tactics had terrorized Union supply lines for months. Margaret had heard countless stories of Mosby's daring raids, his ability to appear and disappear like smoke, and his reputation for showing mercy to civilians while dealing harshly with military opponents. As referenced in Richmond Dispatch coverage of irregular warfare operations, Mosby's Rangers had captured or destroyed millions of dollars worth of Union supplies during 1863, earning him promotion and the grudging respect of his enemies. Margaret held her breath as the Confederate column passed within 50 yards of her hiding place, praying that thunder and tempest would remain silent. The horses seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, standing motionless as statues while the enemy cavalry rode past. But fortune, which had smiled upon Margaret thus far, suddenly turned fickle. One of Mosby's men, a keen-eyed sergeant with the weathered face of a veteran campaigner, spotted something amiss in the grove of trees. He raised his hand, bringing the column to a halt with military precision. "Major," the sergeant called softly, "movement in the trees to our left." Could be nothing, but Mosby's piercing blue eyes immediately focused on Margaret's hiding place. The Grey Ghost had survived countless engagements by trusting his instincts and those of his men, never dismissing potential threats as mere coincidence. "Investigate," Mosby ordered quietly. "Take Jenkins and Crawford with you." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as 3 Confederate cavalrymen approached her position. Discovery would mean certain death, not only for herself, but for the wounded Union soldiers who desperately needed the medical supplies she carried. It was then that Tempest did something that would be remembered in family stories for generations to come. The young Colt, as if understanding the desperate nature of their situation, deliberately stepped on a dry branch, creating a sharp crack that echoed through the grove. The Confederate sergeant immediately spurred his horse toward the sound, his attention fixed on what appeared to be a spooked deer or wild animal fleeing deeper into the woods. In that crucial moment of distraction, Margaret guided Thunder and the wagon quietly away from their original position, moving with the stealth her father had taught her during childhood hunting expeditions. "Just a deer, Major," the sergeant reported upon returning, probably startled by our approach. Mosby nodded, but his eyes continued to scan the grove with professional suspicion. "Continue the patrol, but keep your eyes open. Union supply wagons have been using these back roads to avoid our main camps." The Confederate column resumed its march, disappearing around another bend in the road. Margaret remained hidden for another hour, her hands trembling with delayed reaction to the close encounter. When she finally emerged from the grove, both horses nuzzled her gently, as if offering comfort after the shared ordeal. "Good boys," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're not out of this yet." The remainder of the journey to Brandy Station proved equally harrowing. Confederate patrols seemed to be everywhere, forcing Margaret to take increasingly circuitous routes through fields and forest paths that added hours to her journey. Thunder's strength and endurance proved invaluable, while Tempest's alertness saved them from discovery on 2 additional occasions. When they finally reached the Union lines near Brandy Station, Margaret was exhausted, mud-covered, and emotionally drained. But the sight of the field hospital row upon row of white tents filled with wounded soldiers reminded her of the mission's vital importance. "Miss O'Sullivan." Captain Morrison emerged from the hospital command tent, his face showing. relief and admiration in equal measure. "We'd begun to fear the worst when you didn't arrive on schedule. Confederate cavalry," Margaret explained briefly, too tired for lengthy explanations. "Mosby's Rangers. They're patrolling the main roads in force." Morrison's expression grew grave. "That explains why our last 3 supply wagons never reached their destinations. You may be the first courier to successfully penetrate their patrol network." The medical supplies were quickly unloaded and distributed to the waiting surgeons, who received them with gratitude that needed no words. Margaret watched as morphine was administered to screaming wounded men, seeing their faces relax into peaceful sleep as the blessed drug took effect. "There's more," Morrison said quietly, drawing her aside. "Intelligence reports suggest that Lee is massing his forces for a major offensive. The Battle of Mine Run may commence within days, and casualties are expected to be severe. We need another supply run immediately, this time carrying surgical instruments and ammunition." Margaret looked at Thunder and Tempest, both animals showing the strain of their dangerous journey. The horses had given everything they had, and asking them to repeat such a perilous mission seemed almost cruel. But as she gazed upon the wounded soldiers lying in the hospital tents, she realized that cruelty had many faces. The cruelest act of all might be refusing to help when help was desperately needed. "When do we leave?" she asked simply. Morrison's weathered face cracked into a slight smile. "Dawn tomorrow. But Margaret, if I may use your first name, you should know that this next mission will be even more dangerous. Our intelligence suggests that Mosby has been reinforced and is actively hunting for our supply routes." As night fell over the Union camp, Margaret made her bed in the hospital tent, surrounded by the moans and whispered prayers of wounded soldiers. Tempest and Thunder stood guard nearby, their loyalty transcending the boundaries between human and animal. The dawn of November 3rd, 1863, broke grey and cold over the Virginia countryside, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and the distant rumble of artillery that announced the beginning of the Battle of Mine Run. Margaret O'Sullivan stood beside her wagon, loaded with the most precious cargo she had ever carried: surgical instruments for battlefield, amputations and rifle ammunition for the Union forces who would soon face General Lee's Confederate army in what promised to be one of the war's bloodiest encounters. Thunder and Tempest stood ready in their harness, both animals bearing the scars and weariness of their previous missions. Over the past week, they had completed 4 successful supply runs, earning Margaret a reputation among Union commanders as the most reliable courier in the Virginia theater. But success had come at a terrible cost. Confederate forces were now actively hunting for the mysterious supply wagon that had repeatedly penetrated their lines. "This is the most dangerous mission yet," Captain Morrison warned as he reviewed the route one final time. "Lee's entire army is moving toward Mine Run, and every road between here and Culpeper will be crawling with Confederate troops. If you're captured... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret understood that this time there would be no mercy for a woman caught supplying Union forces on the eve of battle. The stakes had escalated beyond individual survival to the outcome of the war itself. "The 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry is surrounded near Kelly's Ford," Morrison continued, his voice heavy with concern. "They've been holding a crucial river crossing for 3 days, but they're down to their last few rounds of ammunition. Without resupply, they'll be forced to surrender, giving Lee's army a direct route to Washington." Margaret absorbed this information, with growing understanding of her mission's significance. The fate of not just individual soldiers, but potentially the entire Union cause, might depend on her ability to deliver ammunition to the besieged regiment. As referenced in official Union Army dispatches later published in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. The strategic position at Kelly's Ford represented a critical choke point that could determine the success or failure of Lee's offensive campaign. The 23rd Pennsylvania's heroic defense had already entered military legend, but heroism without ammunition was merely martyrdom. "There's something else," Morrison added reluctantly. "Our scouts report that Colonel Ashworth has escaped from military custody. He was being transported to a secure facility when Confederate raiders attacked. The convoy, several guards were killed, and Ashworth disappeared in the confusion." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. Ashworth knew about her courier activities, understood her routes and methods. If he had indeed joined the Confederate forces, her missions would become exponentially more dangerous. "He'll be looking for revenge," she said quietly. "Almost certainly. But Margaret, if we don't get those supplies through, hundreds of good men will die unnecessarily. The choice is yours. No one would blame you for refusing such a dangerous mission." Margaret looked at Thunder and Tempest, remembering how the muddy Colt had first chosen her, how both animals had repeatedly demonstrated loyalty beyond human understanding. They had trusted her with their lives. Now dying soldiers were asking her to do the same. "We'll get through," she said simply. The journey began before full daylight, with Margaret following back roads and game trails that avoided the main Confederate troop movements. The sounds of battle grew louder as they traveled south, the crash of artillery, the rattle of musketry, and the distinctive rebel yell that Confederate forces used to terrify their enemies. Thunder moved with steady determination despite his exhaustion, while Tempest had matured during their dangerous missions into a horse of remarkable intelligence and courage. The Colt no longer needed guidance to sense danger. His alert postures and warning signals had become Margaret's most reliable early warning system. They had covered nearly 20 miles when disaster struck in the form Margaret had most feared. A cavalry patrol appeared suddenly from behind a hill knot. Confederate regulars, but a mixed group of raiders led by a familiar figure in a stolen Union colonel's uniform. Colonel Reginald. Ashworth sat his horse with the arrogant posture she remembered, though his appearance had changed dramatically. His face bore the scars of his earlier fall, and his eyes held the cold glitter of a man consumed by thoughts of revenge. "Miss Margaret O'Sullivan," Ashworth called mockingly as his men surrounded her wagon. "How pleasant to encounter you again under such interesting circumstances." Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol Captain Morrison had given her, but she realized the futility of resistance against a dozen armed men. Instead, she remained silent, hoping against hope that some opportunity for escape might present itself. "I understand you've become quite the little spy," Ashworth continued, dismounting and approaching the wagon. "Running supplies to Union forces, earning blood money while better men fight and die. How disappointingly predictable." He pulled back the canvas, covering her cargo, revealing the precious ammunition and surgical instruments. His expression grew triumphant as he realized the significance of what he had captured. "Ammunition bound for Kelly's Ford, I presume. Well, the 23rd Pennsylvania won't be needing it now. My Confederate friends will be delighted to receive such generous donations to their cause." It was then that Tempest made his final, most courageous choice. The young horse, who had grown from a mud-covered colt into Margaret's most trusted companion, suddenly reared and struck out with his front hooves, catching Ashworth completely off guard. The colonel stumbled backward, cursing, as Tempest's hooves barely missed his head. In that moment of confusion, Thunder also acted, lunging forward with the wagon and creating enough chaos for Margaret to grab her pistol. "Run, boys," she shouted, firing 2 shots into the air to spook the raiders' horses. What followed was a desperate chase across the Virginia countryside, with Margaret's heavily loaded wagon attempting to outrun pursuing cavalry. Thunder and Tempest ran as they had never run before, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that capture meant death for all 3. But the inevitable eventually occurred. Thunder, exhausted from weeks of dangerous missions, stumbled and fell, bringing the wagon to a crashing halt in a shallow creek. Margaret was thrown clear, landing hard on the muddy bank as Confederate bullets whistled overhead. Tempest, free of his harness in the crash, could have easily escaped into the surrounding woods. Instead, he chose to stand between Margaret and the approaching raiders, his small body trembling with exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken, touching. Ashworth sneered as he approached, his pistol drawn. "The filthy Colt chooses loyalty over survival. How wonderfully appropriate." Margaret struggled to her feet, her body aching from the crash, but her spirit defiant. "You're a traitor to everything decent, Ashworth. History will remember you for what you really are. History is written by the victors, my dear Ashworth," replied, raising his weapon. "And today I am victorious." The shot rang out across the Virginia countryside, echoing among the trees like thunder. But it was not Ashworth's pistol that fired, it was a Union carbine in the hands of Captain Morrison, who emerged from the woods with a patrol of cavalry that had been searching for Margaret's overdue wagon. The brief battle that followed left Ashworth and 2 of his men dead, while Margaret, Thunder, and Tempest were rescued from what had seemed certain doom. The ammunition reached Kelly's Ford just as the 23rd Pennsylvania was preparing for their final stand, allowing them to break the Confederate siege and maintain their crucial position. The Battle of Mine Run ended 3 days later with tactical victory for neither side, but strategic advantage to the Union forces who had successfully prevented Lee's offensive from reaching Washington. In the larger scope of history, it was one more step toward the war's eventual conclusion. For Margaret O'Sullivan, the battle's end meant survival and recognition for her courageous service as a Union courier. Thunder recovered from his injuries and lived many peaceful years on the restored O'Sullivan farm. And Tempest, the mud-covered colt who had chosen a poor farmer's daughter over a wealthy man's gold, became the foundation sire of a bloodline that would produce cavalry horses for the United States Army for generations to come. But more than that, their story became a testament to the truth that loyalty, courage, and love are currencies more valuable than gold, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most humble beginnings. In choosing Margaret over Ashworth's wealth, Tempest had chosen not just a person, but a set of values that would outlast any war. The filthy Colt had chosen wisely, and history would remember his choice, long after the guns of Mine Run fell silent forever.